with us tonight. He's a native of Indianapolis, Indiana. He's married to FHU alumna Stephanie Vick of Paragould, Arkansas. He preaches for the Rome Church of Christ, and he graduated from Ambridge University with an MA degree in Biblical Studies in 2018 and Freed-Hardeman with a degree in Spanish in 2007. After graduating from the Memphis School of Preaching in January 2010, he served congregations in Virginia and South Carolina, and aside from spending time with Stephanie and their 4 children, he enjoys reading, studying biblical languages, playing basketball, running, and watching the Indianapolis Colts and Indiana Hoosiers, and we won't hold that against him. So excited that you're here, Donnie. Come talk to us.
I'm so thankful for the opportunity to be with you. I appreciate Brother F.H. Gates asking me to come and speak tonight. Here he's out of town, but it's been great getting to know him over the last year and a half or so. I really appreciate the theme for the summer series, Meeting Jesus in the Gospel of John. And tonight the topic that I have been given has to do with the disciples meeting Jesus in the book of John, in reference especially to John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17. And so if you have a Bible with you, I'd invite your attention to John 13, verses 1 through 17, where we'll have our thoughts tonight. And so as you think about the word disciple, sometimes we define it as a follower. A disciple is someone that follows Jesus, and that's right. But literally, the idea of a disciple is that of a student, a learner. And usually at this time of year, I like to preach a sermon about the school of Christ, because the disciples were in the Lord's school for about 3.5 years. And tonight I want us to think about what the disciples would have learned on this occasion in John chapter 13. Of course, John 13, 1 through 17 tells us about when Jesus washed his disciples' feet. And I want us to think about the context here. Let's first realize that this is, of course, right before Jesus is going to be crucified. This is the same night that he instituted the Lord's Supper. We recognize that this event takes place in the upper room that was reserved for the disciples, and it falls in a specific order of events. And so if you put John 13 in context, I think you'll find that the disciples have gathered to eat the Passover. In Luke chapter 22, verses 14 through 16, we see that the disciples have come to partake of the Passover, and shortly after this event takes place, the Lord is going to recognize that there's been a dispute going on. If you look at Luke chapter 22 and verses 24 through 30, in Luke's account, this is right after the Lord institutes the Lord's Supper. But it says in Luke chapter 22 and verse 24, there was also a strife among them, which of them should be accounted the greatest. They had a fight right after the Lord's Supper took place. Did that ever happen in the church today? Unfortunately, brethren have gone out into the foyer after partaking of the Lord's Supper just 15 or 20 minutes earlier and had a knockdown drag out. Such is shameful, but it's not unexpected because it happened to the Lord's disciples as well. But notice what he says to them. He says here in Luke chapter 22 and verse 25, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and they that exercise authority upon them are called benefactors. But ye shall not be so. But he that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he that is a chief as he that doth serve. For whether is greater, he that sitteth at meat, or he that serveth? Is not he that sitteth at meat? But I am among you as he that serveth. And so Jesus is pointing out to his disciples, you've got to quit the fighting. You've got to quit the bickering, because it's not about who's great. It's about who's a servant. in my kingdom. And he goes on to talk about the kingdom of the church in verse 30. He says, you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that's the setting, that is the background to this story. It doesn't just happen out of blue that Jesus is just going to get down and start washing the apostles' feet. It is in the midst of them bickering about who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom. They, of course, still had this idea that it was going to be a literal kingdom, that the Lord would be appointed a king over Israel, just like David. He was called the son of David, and they thought, well, he's going to have a literal kingdom. But they were mistaken about that. And they were mistaken about that even after the Lord's resurrection in Acts chapter 1, when they said, will thou at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? They were looking for a physical kingdom. But of course, Jesus told Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. It was never going to be a physical kingdom. It was always a spiritual kingdom. And so, with that in mind, the apostles have been bickering, and Jesus gets up from the supper and starts washing the apostles' feet. And so I want us to know what the apostles would have learned from this event that takes place. And so let's go to John chapter 13, and let's read verses 1 and 2. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil, having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. So the first thing that the disciples would have learned about Jesus here on this occasion is that the love of Christ is not selective. It is not picky as to who it's going to love. Jesus loves everyone, even his enemies. Notice that Judas was indeed present. It tells us here in verse 2 that Judas was there. The supper is ended. The King James uses the expression the supper being ended. Other versions indicate that this is the present tense. This is something that was just now taking place. I love the King James Version, but I think it misses it here slightly when it says the supper is ended. The supper was going on. Some versions say during supper, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot. And so Judas is here on this occasion, and Jesus is going to wash his feet. And we know that because Judas is going to be mentioned again later in the chapter. And so after he washes his feet in verse number 5, Judas is going to be mentioned again as being present. Look down at verse 18. Jesus warns about the one that would betray him. I speak not of you all, I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled, he that eateth bread with me hath lifted up his heel against me. And he goes on to say in verse 21, when Jesus had thus said, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. So Jesus is speaking to his 12 apostles on this occasion. Judas has not departed yet, and so Judas would have been present still. This is further seen here down in verse 25. Peter gets John to say, well, Lord, who is it? Who is it? Peter had already been rebuked once at this supper, so I guess he wanted John to ask the question. And so Jesus answered, he it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. And when he dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And then Jesus says to him, of course, what you do quickly. And in verse 30, he then, having received the sop, went immediately out, and it was night. And it was the darkest night that there's ever been, right? When the Son of Man was betrayed. And so Judas was definitely still present when Jesus washed the feet of the apostles. Now, was Judas there when he instituted the Lord's Supper? I'm not sure. I think he might have left right before the Lord instituted the Lord's Supper. It tells us once he received the sop and went out, that's when he left. And so if you look at if you look at Mark's account and also Matthew's account, it seems that once he received the sop, he left, and then Jesus began to speak about the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine that would represent his death on the cross for our sins. But Judas was here. Judas was present and had his feet washed by Jesus. Just think about that. Here is someone who knows all things. He knows exactly who is going to betray him. Verse 11 says, "For he knew who should betray him, therefore said he, Ye are not all clean." But Jesus washed his feet. Could you wash the feet of someone that you know is going to do great harm to you? That you know is going to have you arrested for something that you didn't do? It'd be pretty difficult, wouldn't it? And that's what Jesus did. That's exactly what he did. And of course, he was only living out what he had taught in the great Sermon on the Mount over in Matthew chapter 5 and verses 44 and 45. He said, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that despise you, and that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust." Did you notice what Jesus said? If you love your enemies, you're like the children of your Father. What did God's only Son do? He loved his enemies. He loved his own familiar friend that would betray him. As it says in the book of Psalms, "Mine own familiar friend." And so Jesus loved his enemies. You know, he didn't pick as to who he was going to love and who he wasn't going to love. He didn't choose who he was going to be kind to and who he wasn't going to be kind to. He loved everyone. And you and I can't choose who we're going to love. We are to love our neighbors. Now, does that mean that we can help everybody? No, obviously. We don't have the resources to help everybody. But as we have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially them of the household of faith, Galatians 6:10. We don't get to pick and choose. Well, we like this person, so we're going to be kind to him. We're going to love them. That's the kind of love that the hypocrites have, that Jesus was rebuking in Matthew chapter 5. But Jesus lived out what he taught when it came to loving his enemies. Acts 1 and verse 1 tells us, "The former treatise have I made of all that Jesus began both to do and teach." And so before Jesus taught it, he practiced it. And he practiced his love for his enemies. You know, he at some point picked out Judas. At some point saw something in Judas. And yet Judas, of course, would make the awful mistake that he made. And so the first thing for us to consider tonight is that the apostles would have learned that love is not selective. And we can't be selective as to who we love, whether it be, someone from Indiana like me or someone from the South. We've got to be good to all people, right? It doesn't matter what color we are, what language we speak. We need to be good to all men, especially them of the household of faith. And so, not only is love not selective, but the apostles would have also learned that love requires action. Look at verses 3 through 5. John 13, verses 3 through 5 says, "Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he was come from God and went to God, he riseth from supper and laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. After that he poureth water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded." So we didn't observe this point in verse number 1, but notice what it says again in verse number 1 about the love that Jesus had. It tells us he loved them unto the end. He loved his own which were in the world. And so what John is doing is telling us how Jesus loved people. Love is not a feeling that we get. It is not a emotion, really. It involves the emotions, but love is a choice, and love is an action. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing here. He is loving his apostles by taking action. You can't really love someone if you're not going to do something for them and serve them. That's what Jesus is doing here. He got up. He knew exactly who he was. He came from God and he went to God. So that reminds us of Philippians chapter 2, where it tells us that he, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. Jesus, the Son, the second person of the Godhead, was equal to the Father. He was fully God, and yet he took on the form of a servant so that he could humble himself and be obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. And so Jesus was fully God. He was going back to God to be with the Father. And that shows us a distinction in the persons of the Godhead. It's not one being and three different manifestations as some believe, but you have two separate persons of the Godhead that are being mentioned here. And so he was fully aware of who he was. He was God. He was going to go back to God, where he came from. Why would he need to serve someone? Why would he need to do what he did? Well, because he loved them. He loved them and wanted to teach them a valuable lesson about humble service. And so he riseth from supper. Notice the verbs here in verses number 4 and 5. He riseth from supper. He laid aside his garments. He took a towel and girded himself. And he poureth water into a basin and began to wash the apostles' feet. Those are action verbs. Those are verbs that are telling us he's doing something. Jesus' love for his apostles got up and did something. Notice what it did. First, he arose from the supper. This indicates he had been lying down. Of course, the famous painting of the Last Supper of Jesus is very misleading. It looks like they're at a medieval banquet. But they would have, of course, been reclining around a table, and their feet would have been away from the table. As I understand it, they would have been lying on their left side, and then they would be eating the food with their right hand. Us left-handers were in a world of hurt back then, but that was the practice. And so they were all reclining around the table, and Jesus would have been in a place of honor, of course, because he was the master and teacher. He was the master and Lord. And so he would have been in a place of honor, and yet he gets up. And that was breaking custom for the one being honored at a banquet to get up. And yet he did. And so he gets up and he lays aside his garments. Now, he would have been wearing a coat or a robe over his other clothes that he was wearing. And so he took that off, and that indicated that he was about to work. He was about to do something that required manual labor. It was something that a slave would be wearing. And so he takes off his outer garment, and he begins to wash the feet of the apostles. And so when we think about what Jesus does here, love requires action. And he got up and began working. In 1 John 3 and verse 18, John seems to have learned the lesson that Jesus was talking about here. In 1 John 3:18, the Bible says, "My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth." John says, it's not enough just to talk about it. You've got to actually get up and do it. And all of us fall short from time to time in actually following through in the service that we know we need to do for the Lord. That includes me. There are many times when I fall short of what I know I ought to be doing. But the Lord is merciful and gracious to us. But love requires that we act. Talk is cheap, as Johnny Unitas said in a long ago. talk is cheap. You can talk about winning a ball game. You can talk about doing something, but are you actually going to follow through with it? That's what Johnny Yu's point was all these many years ago. And it's true today. We can talk about the work that we're going to do for the Lord. We can talk about the great programs that we're going to have, and yet we've got to follow through. We've got to see these actions actually get accomplished. And so love requires actions, and Jesus got up. It reminds us of what James said in James chapter 2 and verses 14 through 15. What doth it profit, my brethren, though a man may say he have faith, and have not works, can faith save him? If a brother or sister be naked or destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, Depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding ye give them not those things which are needful to the body, what doth it profit? Even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. And so our faith has got to be backed up by action. Our faith cannot remain quiet. It's got to get up and do something. But notice something else about the love that the disciples would have learned about on this occasion in John chapter 13. Love is often misunderstood. Look at what happens in verses 6 through 9. Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter saith unto him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet? Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. Peter saith unto him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I wash thee not, thou shalt have no part with me. Simon Peter saith unto him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my feet, or my hands and my head. And Jesus saith unto him, He that is washed needeth not, save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit. And ye are clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him, wherefore said he, Ye are not all clean. And so, what Jesus was doing was not understood by the apostles. Peter, in one of his classic moments, says, You're not going to wash my feet. Well, if you're going to wash me, you better wash my whole body then. You're not going to do that to me. They'll never do that. He really emphasizes that Jesus would never, ever do that to him. In verse 6 and 8, where Peter is speaking there, he's really emphasizing the fact that he did not want the Lord to wash his feet. But the Lord said, if you don't learn this object lesson that I'm teaching you, if you don't let me wash your feet, Peter, you're not going to have any part with me. In other words, you're not really going to be my disciple. You're not going to have a place in my kingdom. You're not going to have a part in my inheritance if you don't learn this lesson. And that tells us the importance that we have in learning this lesson of humble service. No one is above service. If Jesus got up and served, then so can we, right? The King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the Creator, the omnipotent one, the Almighty, got down and washed the feet of Judas, the feet of Thomas, who we call doubting Thomas, the feet of Peter that were always in his mouth, so they were especially gross, right? And so Jesus wasn't understood at first. And that's the way it is with us sometimes. Sometimes we try to help someone and they don't understand why we're doing what we're doing. Sometimes we preach a lesson from the pulpit and people don't understand the reason for it. People don't understand maybe why a difficult lesson comes from the pulpit. Well, it's love. That's why we preach the way we do, because we love people. And Jesus is preaching a lesson with his hands and with his water basin that he has. And so love is often misunderstood. And we've got to learn to love people by serving them, as Galatians chapter 4 and chapter 5 and verse 13 tells us, let us serve one another by love. And so love is often misunderstood, but love also meets a need. The disciples had a need here. Their feet were dirty. That's what Jesus says to Peter here in verse number 10. He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet. He's speaking about how when they came into Jerusalem, they would have been purified before beginning to partake of the Lord's Supper or before the Passover. They would have purified themselves. They would have been ceremonially clean before they partook of the Passover. That was a requirement. And so Jesus says, you are all ceremonially clean, but your feet need to be washed. They're dirty. They've been walking around on these dusty streets of Jerusalem. Therefore, you need to be cleaned. You need to have your feet washed. And of course, feet washing was a custom of the day. We do not wash feet today because we have shoes. We have adequate footwear that does not require us to wash our feet. But in ancient times, that was one of the first ways to show hospitality. If you look through the Old Testament, you'll see example after example of people welcoming someone into their home, and the first thing they do is have their feet washed. Genesis 18:4, when the Lord comes to Abraham, what does Abraham do? He has one of his servants wash the feet of his angelic visitors that have come to see him, and the Lord that came to see him on that occasion. And so this was a need that they had, and that's the example for us. Jesus met the need for the occasion. Look at verses 14 and 15. He says to them, "If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, ye also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that ye should do as I have done to you." So Jesus is giving us an example. He's giving the apostles an example. The example that we're to follow is not to wash one another's feet. There are some that have the idea that we ought to wash feet in worship services. Well, that's not what Jesus was getting at here at all. The example is that of humble service to others. That is the example that we're to follow. There are some commands that Jesus gave that we're not to follow, and this would be one of them. Specifically, that we're not to wash the apostles' feet. We're not to wash one another's feet, per se. Now, if that's a need that someone has, then certainly we've got to do that. We've got to serve one another in that way. But Jesus told the paralytic, "Take up thy bed and walk." That's not, of course, a command for all of us to obey today. So there are some things that Jesus said that don't apply to us in that way, and this would be one of them. But the example that we're to follow is that of humble service. And there may be times where serving one another by washing their feet is required. If you're in a foreign country and maybe people don't have the kind of footwear that we have, that would be appropriate, I would think. But there are other ways that we can wash one another's feet in a figurative way. How about helping out a widow who needs help around the house, who she just lost her husband and she doesn't know how to operate a lawnmower maybe, or she doesn't know about the book. She needs help getting her checkbooks figured out. These are great ways that we can wash the feet of those that are in need. What about helping out a young mother who's struggling with her kids, who's having difficulty? Those are ways that we can wash one another's feet, ways that we can help each other. And so love meets a need, and we've got to look for the needs that people have. We've got to understand our brethren. Sometimes we are so caught up in our little bubble and all the little activities that we're caught up in, and we don't remember we have a responsibility to one another. In the Lord's church, we're a family. That means we've got to act like it. Sometimes we call one another brother and sister, but we don't always have any idea what kind of trouble their house is going through. We all have problems that we're facing, and if we are family, we'll be involved in each other's lives. The early church met on a daily basis. They met daily and ate house to house. Acts chapter 2 and verse 46. And so I'm not saying we've got to eat at each other's house every day, but we ought to be involved in each other's lives. We've got to understand what our family is going through. Notice in the fifth place tonight, love is humble. That's what the apostles would have learned from the Lord here. Here they're bickering about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. Seems like it might have been James and John. In Matthew chapter 20, James and John are rebuked for fighting about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. In Luke chapter 22, we see someone's fighting about who's going to be great in the kingdom. Let's go back to Luke chapter 22 again. Luke chapter 22 and verse 24. And there was also a strife among them, which of them should be accounted the greatest. James and John even had their own mother ask the Lord on occasion, do you think you could give James and John the best seats in the kingdom? Have them sit at your right and your left hand? And Jesus, of course, sets them all straight in Luke chapter 22 and also here in John 13 by washing the feet of these individuals. Washing feet was reserved for women and children or slaves in the Lord's day. In 1 Samuel 25, verse 41, we see Abigail coming to offer to wash the feet of David and the feet of his men. In Luke chapter 7 and verse 38, you have Jesus at Simon's house, Simon the Pharisee's house, and he doesn't offer the Lord any kind of hospitality, but rather there is a woman that comes, a prostitute that comes and humbly serves the Lord. Look at Luke chapter 7 and verse 38. This is Simon, one of the Pharisees' house. It tells us in verse 38 that, and stood at the feet of Jesus behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed the feet, and anointed them with the ointment. And of course the Pharisee says, Jesus, if you knew who this person was, you wouldn't let her do that to you. But what does Jesus say to him, to Simon? In verse 44, he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. And so this is one example of a woman washing the feet. This was a lowly chore, a menial task, and Jesus took on this task. And so Jesus says, if I, your master or your teacher and Lord, have washed feet, then you ought to as well. Notice he says in verse 14, if I then, your Lord and master, have washed your feet, ye also ought, must, should, it's the idea, wash the feet of others. And so Jesus is demonstrating the greatest kind of leadership, servant leadership. He came to minister, not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. And so Jesus showed that to perfection, did he not? But then notice one final thing about love that the apostles would have learned on this occasion, and that is, love is happiness. Notice he says in verse 17, if ye know these things, happy are ye if you do them. Do you want to be happy in your life? Do you want to be truly happy? This word happy is translated blessed in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If we want to be happy, then we will humbly serve one another. True happiness, the Lord is telling us, is coming from doing what the Lord did, by humbly serving one another. James tells us in James 1:22, be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. That's what Jesus is saying here. Now, it's good that you know it, but if you want to be happy, you'll do these things. You will humbly serve one another. The way up is down. It's through humble service. James 4 and verse 10 tells us, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. 1 Peter 5 and verse 6 says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, and he will exalt you in due time. The apostles had it all backwards. They were waiting for God to exalt them without humbling themselves. But Jesus tells us, if you want to be happy, you're going to have to humbly serve one another. So as we look at the apostles here in John 13, they would have learned some important things that we need to learn about love and loving as Christ loved. If we want to have true love, then we'll not be selective. We're not going to be picky as to who we're going to be good to. We'll love our neighbor. We will love those that are around us and those that are in need. We will not just love in word and in tongue, but we will love in deed and in truth as well. If we're going to love like the Lord did, we might be misunderstood at times, but we'll be meeting the needs of others, and we will be humbly serving others. And that's the way to true happiness. I so appreciate your good attention tonight, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here.